I never imagined a simple Friday dinner could redirect the fate of an entire corporation. It was supposed to be a quiet evening, nothing glamorous, just a modest bistro hidden behind an old bookstore, a place where conversations mattered more than menus. Clara and I had spent weeks working on the same project, and this was the first time we allowed ourselves a moment outside fluorescent lights and deadlines. The waiter brought us a shared dish and 2 glasses of house wine. Clara smiled, relieved to be somewhere human for once. That serenity lasted 3 minutes. Vanessa, the CEO's daughter, stormed in like a walking announcement of wealth, designer heels, an entourage armed with smartphones, and a voice that demanded attention without earning it. She spotted us instantly, her grin stretched with the thrill of humiliation. "This is your date? On that budget?" she jeered, flicking her eyes toward the barely $40 bill. Her friends gasped like they had witnessed a scandal. Phone cameras rose, flashes burst, and laughter ricocheted across the room. A couple at the next table whispered. Clara shrank in her seat, fingers trembling around her glass. Every instinct in me wanted to answer, to crush her arrogance with words she couldn't swallow. But I stayed silent. Silence was not surrender, it was strategy. Vanessa assumed she had scored a social victory. She didn't realize she had triggered something much larger. She lived in a world where value was defined by labels and zeros. I lived in a world of systems, contracts, and consequences. As her laughter echoed behind us, I felt no shame. I wasn't embarrassed by the meal. I was calculating. Because buried inside my employment file were signatures her father never read, clauses capable of turning mockery into a corporate catastrophe. And Vanessa had just paid the deposit. By Monday morning, the dinner incident had mutated into a full-fledged corporate spectacle. I entered the office to find whispers trailing behind me like smoke. Screens flickered off when I passed, and colleagues exchanged awkward smiles, unsure whether to greet me or pretend they hadn't seen me. Vanessa had spent the weekend turning her mockery into a narrative. I was emotionally unstable. I had embarrassed her publicly, and most importantly, I had crossed a line. The irony was painful. Her humiliation campaign had become my crime. HR summoned me before I could even set my bag down. The room smelled of disinfectant and discomfort. A printed statement waited on the table, already prepared, as if my presence was just an administrative formality. "Your behavior does not align with the professional image we uphold," they recited, eyes glued to a script. Not one person asked what happened. They didn't want truth, they wanted compliance. The CEO joined by speakerphone and demanded a public apology to his daughter. I refused, not with emotion, but with calm clarity. It was the silence after my refusal that frightened them. By the afternoon, my digital existence began dissolving. Access codes suddenly expired. Calendar invitations vanished. Projects I had initiated were quietly transferred to junior staff, too inexperienced to understand what they were inheriting. Old emails, harmless messages taken out of context, were forwarded to HR as concerns. It was a slow erasure, meticulously designed to make me resign, without them ever lifting a visible hand. But their strategy was flawed. They believed removing me from meetings meant removing my influence. They forgot I was the architect of the expansion database, the system that connected clients, vendors, and forecasts. They forgot contracts are not decorative. They are weapons. And mine had been loaded for years. The company thought I was merely a replaceable technician, a cog they could discard without consequence. What they had forgotten, or perhaps never truly understood, was the price of my loyalty years ago. When the infrastructure failed during a critical expansion phase, I was the one who rebuilt it from the ground up. I worked nights that bled into mornings, slept under my desk, and delivered solutions no one else could produce. They couldn't afford my overtime, so they compensated me with something they assumed was symbolic: profit-linked equity tied to the company's valuation. Buried inside the agreement, between performance clauses, intellectual property terms, and generic legal language, was a paragraph the CEO skimmed at midnight and signed without reading. It stated that if any member of the executive family publicly defamed me, I could trigger a mandatory valuation event and demand immediate settlement of my stake at market rate. It was designed as a safeguard, a small protection in case my work was ever used against me. At the time, no one imagined the CEO's daughter would be the detonator. When Vanessa mocked me publicly, recorded it, and allowed the clip to circulate among employees, she didn't just bruise my pride, she activated a contractual tripwire. What she saw as entertainment was, in legal terms, defamation tied directly to an executive family member. I didn't shout, I didn't protest. I simply filed a notice, referencing the clause she had unknowingly awakened. The legal department panicked. They read the agreement 3 times before believing their eyes. The CEO's face drained of color when he realized his signature had turned a joke into a corporate liability. Vanessa's humiliation wasn't childish. It was expensive. While she laughed at my dinner bill, she unknowingly wrote the invoice her father would soon have to pay. The clause didn't just rattle a few lawyers, it detonated an earthquake. Within 72 hours of my notice, external auditors marched into headquarters, badges visible, laptops open, expressions carved from stone. The glass meeting rooms that once hosted cheerful presentations now held silent interrogations. Every file, every invoice, every internal transaction from the past 5 years was suddenly under review. Those who once strutted through the corridors now walked like suspects in their own crime scene. The board, accustomed to untouchable authority, found themselves whispering like schoolchildren caught cheating. They weren't worried about me. They were terrified of the valuation process I had forced. If the company's true worth was exposed, then so were the decisions, shortcuts, and hidden deals that supported it. The CEO, who once dismissed me as a harmless nuisance, tried to summon his old intimidation tactics. But shouting doesn't work when the threat standing across the table has a legally binding right to dismantle your empire. His lawyers begged him to stay quiet. Every word he uttered could be interpreted as retaliation and multiply the damages. Meetings were abruptly canceled. Projects halted mid-sentence. Executives disappeared behind closed doors for hours. Overnight, the building transformed from a workplace into a bunker. The valuation team uncovered something the CEO had never expected. The shares they casually handed me during their moment of desperation were now tied to divisions that had exploded in profitability. My stake wasn't an honorary gesture, it was a controlling artery in the company's financial bloodstream. By triggering the clause, I hadn't just asked for compensation, I had demanded a price that eclipsed Vanessa's entire trust fund. The dinner she mocked cost $40. The audit her laughter provoked? It cost millions. And the board was just beginning to understand the tab. When the valuation process began, something remarkable happened. The doors that management once slammed in my face started opening on their own. I didn't storm into meeting rooms. I walked in calmly, documents in hand, because my triggered clause granted me access to any strategic discussion affecting my stake. The shock on their faces was almost comical. The same executives who once ignored my emails now paused mid-sentence when I entered, waiting to see whether I approved or objected. It didn't take long for investors to notice the power shift. They bypassed the CEO entirely and contacted me directly, seeking clarification on forecasts, partnerships, and product rollouts. I had spent years engineering the systems that supported their growth, and now the financial community realized I was the only person who could explain the numbers without stumbling. Department heads, who had once parroted whatever the CEO wanted to hear, now requested my signature before moving forward. Authority no longer resided in a title, it resided in competence. The CEO tried to reassert dominance with speeches about unity and respect for hierarchy, but his tone lacked conviction. His influence was evaporating faster than he could mask it. He wasn't losing control because I took it, he was losing control because he didn't understand how power worked. His daughter's mockery had turned me into a stakeholder, not an employee. And stakeholders aren't managed, they are negotiated with. Meanwhile, Vanessa watched from a distance, bewildered. She thought she had embarrassed a colleague. Instead, she had unintentionally handed him a seat beside her father. What she mocked as a cheap dinner was now being converted into a financial reckoning her family couldn't digest. She laughed at a restaurant bill. The bill she should have feared was the corporate valuation report addressed to her father, signed by me. The valuation report arrived on a stormy Thursday morning, delivered in a thick envelope that might as well have been a death certificate. The numbers were devastating, not for me, but for the board. My equity, awarded casually years ago as a cheap alternative to a bonus, had ballooned into a stake so valuable it shook the foundations of their financial planning. The clause I triggered cornered them into a decision no one wanted to make. The board convened an emergency session. The options were simple, yet catastrophic. Option 1. Pay me the full value of my equity, an amount that would drain reserves, send stock price plummeting, and trigger lender panic. Option 2. Grant me voting rights equivalent to my shares, effectively handing me a seat at the table, influence over strategy, and the power to veto decisions they believed only bloodlines could handle. Every executive around that table had built their careers on nepotism, alliances, and favors. The idea that someone like me, who started with a laptop, not a last name, could sit beside them was unthinkable. They argued for hours, voices cracking, calculators hammering, reputations sweating. The final decision was desperate: divide the empire. They carved out assets, subsidiaries, and intellectual properties, attempting to reduce my ownership without handing me the kingdom. But math doesn't care about pride. When the dust settled, the numbers were irreversible. I walked away with 46% ownership, not symbolic, not honorary, but structural. Nearly half the empire rested in my hands. The CEO stared at the contract like it was a verdict. Vanessa, who once sneered at my dinner receipt, now understood what her mockery had cost. Not a moment of embarrassment, but the family legacy her father spent decades constructing. Her laughter didn't just echo. It invoiced them. The company had always prided itself on stability, predictable growth, loyal clients, and a spotless reputation. That illusion shattered within days. Clients who once signed contracts without hesitation suddenly requested meetings. They sensed something was wrong long before the board admitted it. They noticed new faces in leadership presentations, unfamiliar pauses in financial updates, and an uncomfortable silence whenever my name surfaced. What began as curiosity evolved into suspicion. Investors weren't as patient. They demanded explanations the CEO couldn't provide without incriminating himself. Every attempt to reassure stakeholders only worsened the damage. Numbers contradicted speeches, and confidence evaporated. The share price dipped once, then again, then spiraled. No one could understand how a dinner receipt had mutated into a crisis capable of threatening an entire corporate dynasty. And the rumors flourished faster than facts. Vanessa's friends, always eager for spectacle, turned her humiliation into a legend. They whispered that she had mocked the wrong person, that her arrogance had detonated the company's fortune. What she saw as harmless ridicule became a cautionary tale about the cost of disrespect. Suddenly, laughter was no longer social currency, it was evidence. Her world shrank quickly. Invitations stopped. Group chats dried up. The same people who giggle behind camera lenses now avoided eye contact. No one wanted to be associated with the heiress who triggered a corporate downfall. Her father, overwhelmed by the financial consequences, stopped defending her, not out of malice but exhaustion. The board canceled the Christmas gala, a decades-old tradition, claiming cost optimization, though everyone knew it was symbolic punishment. Every hallway she walked through now echoed with her own question: how could a $40 dinner become a $40 million disaster? She thought my budget embarrassed her. She never considered what her entitlement would cost when the bill came due. And this time, it wasn't the waiter presenting it. Today, I walk through the same lobby where interns once handed me visitor badges, yet the reception staff now rise when I enter. My name isn't on a cubicle anymore. It's etched beside the CEO's on corporate filings. I co-own the company I once fetched coffee in, not because I schemed for power, but because those in power underestimated the quiet man who read contracts instead of gossip. I never slammed a door. I never leaked an email. I never sabotaged a system. While others shouted, I signed. While they plotted, I documented. The company was undone not by anger, but by compliance. Every action they took to diminish me only activated rights they didn't bother to understand. I didn't build my revenge, they funded it. Vanessa still roams the building occasionally, though her steps are smaller and her laughter is gone. She used to glide through corridors as if she owned gravity. Now she avoids meeting rooms where my decisions are discussed. She once mocked the price of my dinner, convinced value came from labels and zeros. She never realized that dignity doesn't wear price tags. Ignorance does. The lesson she missed is the one adults learn after their first real failure. A budget dinner can feed the stomach, but an entitled insult can ignite a legal fire that burns through inheritance, reputation, and comfort. The receipt she laughed at bought her more than embarrassment. It purchased my silence long enough for the law to mature into consequence. I didn't confront her. I didn't humiliate her. I simply collected what arrogance owed me. Her words were a spark. My contracts were gasoline. When flames reached the boardroom, I didn't shout victory. I just signed paperwork. Revenge is a noise. Revenge is equity. And equity always speaks last.